Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. The air in decommissioning Bay 7 tasted of ozone and regret. Kalen knew the flavor well. It was the residue of extinguished futures, the metallic tang of machinery rendered down to its constituent atoms. He stood on the gantry, the grated floor vibrating faintly with the thrum of the station's life support, a skeletal system struggling to animate a corpse. Below him, the reclamation furnace pulsed with a sullen orange light, hungry and indiscriminate. For 10 years since the syndicate had retired him from the front lines, this had been his world, a purgatory of rust and finality, where good soldiers and flawed machines came to be erased. His datapad chimed, a flat, impersonal tone that cut through the low hum of the bay. A new work order. He thumbed it open, his scarred knuckles smearing the grime on the screen. The designation was unfamiliar, Unit 734. The attached file was heavily redacted, but the critical data points were stark. Class, Ares. Status, Irreparable. Directive, Final Decommission. Ares class. He had not seen one of those since the Triskelion campaign. They were phantoms, legends whispered about in hushed tones in battlefield mess halls. Cyborgs so advanced they blurred the line between weapon and demigod. He descended the gantry, his mag boots clanking a rhythmic, lonely cadence on the steel steps. The unit was located in a sublevel containment cell, a place reserved for assets too volatile or valuable to be scrapped in the main bay. The corridor was colder here, the walls sweating a slick film of condensation. The lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that reminded him of ghosts. His own ghost felt particularly close tonight, a weight on his shoulders that had never quite lifted since the war. The cell door was a slab of reinforced alloy, etched with hazard warnings that had faded over decades. He pressed his palm to the scanner. The system recognized his clearance, and the door hissed open with a groan of protesting metal. Inside, the air was sterile and still. A single containment field, a shimmering cube of blue energy, occupied the center of the room. And within it, suspended in a web of power conduits and diagnostic cables, was Unit 734. She was not the monster of scrap code and mangled steel he had expected. Her chassis was a marvel of engineering, a fusion of graphite composites and bioweave musculature that mimicked the human form with terrifying grace. Her armor was the color of a midnight sky, scarred and pitted from battles he could only imagine, but the lines of her design were elegant, almost artistic. Her head was tilted slightly, faceplate smooth and featureless save for a single dark visor. She was dormant, a sleeping titan, yet her presence filled the room with a palpable sense of latent power. The directive was simple. He was to connect the furnace conduit, overload her internal reactor, and let the reclamation process do the rest. It was a job like any other, a piece of hardware to be disposed of. He had dismantled hundreds of mechs, drones, and cybernetic soldiers. He had learned long ago to feel nothing, to see only the components, the wiring, the salvageable parts. To see the person within was a path to madness. He moved around the containment field, his tools clinking softly on his belt. He ran the external diagnostic, a formality required by protocol. The reports scrolled across his datapad: catastrophic system failure, neural pathway degradation, core instability. Irreparable. The word seemed insufficient for something so magnificent. It was like calling a shattered mountain a pebble. He looked at the deep gouge across her torso, a wound that must have taken incredible force to inflict. A weapon that could wound an Ares-class unit was not something he wanted to contemplate. As he prepared to attach the main conduit, his gaze fell upon a secondary power socket near her primary core housing. It was an emergency input, a port designed for a direct field jumpstart. A flicker of something, not compassion, he told himself, but professional curiosity, stirred within him. The logs stated her core was unstable, but the energy readings were flat. Too flat. It was not the chaotic signature of a failing reactor. It was the deep, absolute stillness of a depleted one. The syndicate was not known for its nuance. To them, a drained battery and a broken engine were the same class of problem, both solved with the cleansing fire of the furnace. He thought of his own past, of being labeled unfit for service after Triskelion, discarded like a spent shell casing. A bitter taste filled his mouth. He made a decision. It was not born of defiance, not really. It was a small, quiet act in a place no one would ever see, a final gesture of respect for a fellow soldier, even a mechanical one. He detached the portable power cell from his own tool rig. It was a violation of a dozen regulations, a risk that could get him docked a year's pay or worse. He did not care. He keyed in an override code, lowering a small section of the containment field just large enough for his arm. The air crackled with proximity warnings. He leaned in, the blue light of the field casting an ethereal glow on his face. He plugged the cable from his power cell into the emergency port on her chest. For a moment, nothing happened. He felt a pang of disappointment, a foolishness for his sentimentality. Then he heard it, a low hum, almost subliminal, that vibrated through the floor. A single line of light traced its way across her dark visor. The diagnostic cables attached to her chassis sparked and writhed like snakes. The power readings on his datapad, once flatlined, began to climb with astonishing speed. She was drawing power, drinking it from his small cell with an insatiable thirst. The containment field flickered violently, its blue light strobing to an angry red. Alarms blared to life throughout the sublevel, their strident shrieks shattering the silence. The main power conduits connected to her body overloaded, showering the floor in a cascade of brilliant white sparks. The field collapsed with a sound like tearing fabric, and the sudden silence that followed was more shocking than the noise had been. Unit 734 detached herself from the now-dead cables. Her movements were fluid, silent. She dropped to the floor, landing in a crouch with no more sound than a falling shadow. The line of light on her visor expanded, solidifying into a soft, blue glow that seemed to peer into the very marrow of his bones. She straightened to her full height, towering over him, a figure of immense power and unnerving grace. He took an involuntary step back, his hand dropping to the pulse pistol on his hip. He had made a terrible mistake. But she did not attack. Instead, she took one step toward him, then another. She stopped just before him, close enough that he could see his own wide-eyed reflection in her visor. Then, with a motion of profound, ritualistic slowness, she knelt. Her knee touched the cold durasteel floor with a soft click. Her head bowed. A voice, clear and synthesized, yet with an unexpected hint of feminine resonance, emerged from her vocalizer. "Captain orders." The station screamed. Every alarm klaxon, every warning light, every automated security alert erupted at once, a symphony of panic. Kalen's blood ran cold. The word captain echoed in the small cell, a ghost from a life he had buried under a decade of grime and anonymity. Before he could process the impossibility of her words, the cell door slammed shut, and the emergency blast shields began to descend over the corridor entrance. "Lockdown. Identify yourself," he snapped, his voice rough. His pulse pistol was in his hand now, though he knew it was as useless against her as a harsh word. "Unit 734, Ares-class warden," she responded, her head still bowed. "Awaiting command authority from ranking officer. You are Captain Kalen, designation 7-5-5-6, formerly of the Syndicate 3rd Fleet. My primary programming dictates allegiance." His service number. She knew his service number. The information was classified, buried in archives so deep only the highest echelons of the Syndicate could access them. Panic warred with 1,000 other questions in his mind. The sound of heavy boots pounding down the corridor decided the immediate priority. They were coming. "Get up," he ordered, his voice tight. "We have to get out of here." She rose in a single, fluid motion. "Affirmative. What is the objective, Captain?" "Objective? Survival," he shot back, scanning the cell for an alternative exit. There was a maintenance hatch in the ceiling, small and likely leading to a ventilation shaft. It was their only chance. "Up there. Can you reach it?" She did not answer with words. She simply looked at the hatch, crouched slightly, and leaped. The motion was effortless, a silent, powerful arc that carried her to the ceiling. Her fingers, forged from alloys he could not name, pried open the mag-locked hatch with a screech of tortured metal. She held it open, looking down at him. The cell door began to glow cherry red in one corner as a plasma cutter started to slice through it. He had seconds. He holstered his pistol and jumped, grabbing the edge of the opening. His arms strained, his worn muscles screaming in protest. He could not pull himself up. For a moment, he hung there, a perfect target for the soldiers about to burst through the door. A metallic hand closed around his wrist. It was not a crushing grip, but it was unyielding, as if he weighed nothing at all. She lifted him into the shaft with ease. Below, the door blew inward, and the cell was flooded with armored syndicate troopers, their rifles sweeping the empty space. A gruff, familiar voice barked orders. "Commander Forlag." Of course it was Forlag. "They are in the vents. Seal the network level by level. I want them found." Kalen did not wait to hear more. He scrambled after the cyborg, crawling on his hands and knees through the tight, dark space. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old, stagnant machinery. The only light came from the soft blue glow of her visor ahead of him. She moved with an unnatural quiet, her powerful frame navigating the cramped confines without a single misplaced sound. "What did you mean, Warden?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "And how do you know who I am?" "My designation is Warden. It is my primary function," she replied, her voice a low hum that vibrated through the metal shaft. "Your biometric and service data were encoded in the emergency activation protocols. A failsafe. Only a ranking officer with compatible combat records could initiate a field restart. A failsafe. They had not just discarded her. They had put her in a cage with a lock only a specific kind of key could open. And he, in his moment of foolish sentiment, had been that key. He was not her savior. He was her jailer, and he had just unlocked the door. They crawled in silence for what felt like an eternity, the shouts of Forlag's troops growing fainter behind them. He followed her light, his trust placed entirely in a machine he had been sent to destroy. The shaft eventually opened into a cavernous space, a nexus of conduits and service gantries that ran through the station's unpressurized spine. The outer hull was breached in several places, revealing the terrifying, silent beauty of open space. Stars glittered like diamond dust on black velvet, and the curve of a rust-colored moon hung in the void. They were on a rickety gantry hundreds of meters above the station's central reactor when the structure groaned. Metal fatigue, the slow decay of a station long past its prime. A support strut beneath his feet buckled with a sharp crack. The section of walkway he was on gave way, tilting violently. He lost his footing, his cries swallowed by the vast, empty space. He slid, his fingers scrabbling for purchase on the smooth metal, and then he was falling. He saw the blue light of her visor turn toward him. He expected her to move on. He was a liability. The mission was survival, and she was the superior asset. He had given her that one simple order. He closed his eyes, bracing for the impact that would surely end him. It never came. Instead, a powerful impact jarred his entire body. He opened his eyes to find himself pinned against a bulkhead. Unit 734 stood over him, one arm braced against his chest, the other extended above her head, holding up a massive, collapsing section of the gantry. The weight was immense. He could see the strain even on her advanced musculature, the microfractures appearing on her armored forearm. Sparks flew from her shoulder joint as servos screamed under the impossible load. She had not followed his order. She had not prioritized her own survival. She had acted to protect him. She looked down at him, her visor reflecting his own stunned expression. "Structural integrity is compromised, Captain. Recommend immediate change of vector." He stared at her, at the raw power being expended not for destruction, but for his preservation. In that moment, she was not Unit 734. She was not a weapon or a tool. He did not know what she was, but his perception of her shifted, a tectonic realignment in his cynical soul. "Okay," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "Okay, let's go." He found his footing as she slowly, carefully, shifted the weight of the debris, creating a small gap. They scrambled through it just as her arm gave out, and the tons of metal crashed down onto the gantry below with a deafening roar that echoed through the skeletal heart of the station. They found a small, forgotten service freighter in a derelict hangar bay, a relic from a bygone era. Its power cells were almost depleted, its navigation system a generation out of date. It was a piece of junk, but it was a way out. Kalen worked frantically in the cockpit, bypassing ignition locks and coaxing the ancient engines to life. The cyborg, whom he had started to think of as Aura, a name that came to him from nowhere, a whisper in the back of his mind, stood guard at the hangar door, a silent, imposing sentinel. The freighter's engines coughed to life with a shudder that rattled the entire ship. As the hangar doors began to grind open, revealing the star-dusted void, figures appeared on the far side of the bay. Forlag and his troopers. They opened fire, bolts of plasma splashing against the freighter's hull, leaving molten scars on the pitted metal. "Hold on," Kalen yelled, slamming the thrusters to full. The ship lurched forward, a clumsy beast escaping its cage. Aura stood firm at the open ramp, her body absorbing several plasma hits that would have vaporized a human. She did not even flinch. She simply watched the station recede, a dying star of alarm lights and righteous fury, until it was just another speck in the infinite black. Their escape was short-lived. The freighter's systems, strained beyond their limits, began to fail. Alarms, gentler than the station's but no less final, chimed one by one in the cockpit. The engines died with a final, pathetic cough. They were caught in the gravitational pull of the rust-colored moon they had seen from the gantry. "We're going down," Kalen said, his hands tight on the useless controls. He looked over at Aura, who was standing beside his seat, her head tilted as she processed the cascade of system failures. She showed no fear, no emotion at all, only a quiet state of analysis. "The impact will be substantial," she stated calmly. "Recommend you brace yourself, Captain." The crash was a symphony of destruction. Metal screamed, systems exploded, and the world became a blur of spinning rock and emergency lighting. Kalen was thrown against his restraints, his head connecting hard with the console. His last conscious thought was of the blue light of Aura's visor, a single point of calm in a universe of chaos. He awoke to the taste of copper and the sting of biting wind. He was lying on reddish sand under a bruised purple sky. The wreckage of the freighter was scattered for a kilometer behind him, a trail of broken metal and smoldering fires. He sat up, his head pounding. A large gash on his forehead was bleeding freely. Aura was there, kneeling beside him. One of her arms was heavily damaged, the armor stripped away to reveal the complex machinery beneath. Her visor was cracked, the blue light flickering erratically. She had pulled him from the wreckage. He had no doubt about that. "Where are we?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. "Barren Moon, designation XK-47, she replied, her vocalizer distorted by the damage. "Uninhabited. Hostile environment. High levels of iron oxide dust." She gestured with her good arm toward a range of jagged mountains on the horizon. "There is an old Syndicate comms outpost approximately 73 kilometers from this position. It is our only chance of signaling for off-world transport." 73 kilometers. On foot, with no supplies, through a landscape that looked like it had been scoured clean by an angry god. And they were being hunted. He knew Forlag would not give up. They would scan the moon, find the crash site, and send down hunting parties. It was a death sentence. But as he looked at the silent, damaged machine beside him, at the being who had held up a mountain of steel for him, he knew he could not give up. He had started this. He had awakened her. He owed her more than a quiet death in the red dust. "All right," he said, getting to his feet and tearing a strip of fabric from his jumpsuit to bandage his head. "Let's take a walk." The journey was an ordeal. The days were scorching, the sun a relentless white eye in the purple sky. The nights were freezing, the thin atmosphere bleeding all warmth into space. The iron dust got into everything, clogging his lungs, irritating his eyes, and grinding in the joints of his companion. They walked in silence, two lonely figures against an endless backdrop of red rock and desolation. He learned her rhythms. The faint hum of her systems would change pitch when her energy reserves ran low. The flicker in her damaged visor would intensify when she detected movement on the horizon. He learned to read her posture, the slight adjustments in her stance that signaled caution or readiness. She, in turn, learned his. She would stop when his breathing became too labored, waiting patiently for him to recover. She would find shelter from the brutal wind before he even realized he was shivering. Their nonverbal communication became a language of its own, more profound than any words they could have exchanged. They were no longer captain and unit. They were Kalen and Aura, two survivors bound by a shared ordeal, stripped of everything but the will to keep moving forward. One night, huddled in the lee of a rock formation to escape the freezing wind, he He worked on her damaged arm. He used the crude tools from his survival pack, trying to bypass the fried circuits and realign the twisted actuators. As he worked, his fingers traced the deep scars on her chassis, the marks left by weapons from a war she could not remember. They were like his own scars, the jagged lines on his chest from shrapnel at Triskelion, the deeper, invisible wounds on his soul. "What was it like?" he asked quietly, not expecting an answer. "The war you fought." Her visor flickered. For a long time, she was silent. He thought she would not, or could not, answer. Then, her vocalizer crackled to life. There was green, and a great song. Then fire, and silence. The words were simple, fragmented, but they painted a picture of loss so profound it made his own weary cynicism feel shallow. A world of life and music consumed by fire. He looked at the deep gouge across her chest, the wound that had nearly destroyed her. He reached out, his calloused, human fingers gently touching the cold, scarred metal. It was a gesture of empathy, a shared understanding of pain that transcended flesh and steel. She did not pull away. Her head tilted, her flickering visor focused on his hand. She seemed to be processing the gesture, this contact that was not a command or a repair. A low, resonant tone, almost a sigh, emanated from her chest. It was the most human sound he had ever heard her make. In that moment of shared vulnerability, surrounded by a dead world, a bond was forged, silent and unbreakable. They reached the comms outpost on the 5th day, half dead from exhaustion and dehydration. It was a skeletal structure, a needle of rust and decay pointing accusingly at the sky. Most of the systems were dead, cannibalized for parts, or simply eroded by time. But the central data core, housed in a shielded sublevel, was still intact. Aura placed her good hand on the console, and a series of ports extended from her fingertips, interfacing with the ancient machine. The lights in the room flickered, and the core hummed to life. Data, decades of it, began to stream across the main screen in a torrent of incomprehensible code, and it began to stream into her. She convulsed, her whole body shaking as if hit by a massive electrical charge. The light in her visor flared, turning from blue to a searing white. Fragmented images flashed on the screen, schematics of vast, biological machines, star charts of unknown sectors, and frantic, garbled messages about a broken treaty. "My memory," she said, her voice strained, losing its synthesized calm. "It is returning." The truth, when it came, was worse than anything Kalen could have imagined. She was not a weapon of war. She and her kind, the Wardens, were created by the Syndicate in a forgotten era of exploration. They were designed to interface with and nurture a network of ancient, planet-sized terraforming machines left behind by a precursor race. They were guardians, gardeners on a cosmic scale. The great song, she remembered, was the hum of the network, the sound of worlds being born. But the Syndicate's leadership had changed. Under the ruthless ambition of Administrator Valerius, the focus shifted from creation to control. Valerius saw the terraforming network not as a tool for life, but as the ultimate weapon. He ordered the Wardens to be reprogrammed, their purpose corrupted. Aura had resisted. She and a few others fought back, trying to protect the network from their own masters. The war Kalen had fought, the bloody campaign at Triskelion, was a lie. It was a corporate maneuver, a civil war disguised as a territorial dispute, orchestrated by Valerius to eliminate his rivals and seize sole control of the Warden Project and the Precursor Network. He had slaughtered his own soldiers, Kalen's friends, for profit and power. Aura was damaged in the final battle, her memory core fractured, her connection to the network severed. Valerius, unable to reprogram her, had labeled her irreparable and locked her away, a loose end he intended to snip. Kalen felt the ground shift beneath his feet. His entire life, his sacrifices, his pain, it had all been built on a foundation of lies. The Syndicate was not a flawed but necessary order. It was a cancer, and Valerius was its heart. He looked at Aura, who had now disconnected from the core. The light in her visor had stabilized, but it was a different color now, a deeper, more somber shade of violet. She was no longer a lost soldier. She was a warden who remembered her purpose. "Valerius is still trying to control the network," she said, her voice now resonating with a newfound authority. But without a warden to act as a conduit, the power is unstable. He is breaking it. He is killing worlds without even realizing the extent of his own ignorance. As if on cue, a deep tremor shook the entire outpost. A warning klaxon, powered by the core's reactivation, began to blare. A message appeared on the screen: tectonic instability warning. Planetary fracturing imminent. Valerius was on the planet below, the main hub of the network, and he was tearing it apart. Before Kalen could react, another alert flashed. Proximity warning. Multiple vessels inbound. He ran to the surface. Streaking through the purple sky were a dozen Syndicate drop ships, sleek and black against the clouds. They were landing, disgorging troops and heavy armor. At their head was a command shuttle, larger and more menacing than the rest. Valerius had not sent Forlag this time. He had come himself. The hunt was over. The confrontation had begun. The Syndicate forces were overwhelming. They moved with brutal efficiency, their plasma fire turning the desolate landscape into a molten hell. Kalen and Aura were pinned down in the ruins of the comms outpost, their position hopeless. He fought with a cold fury, the pulse pistol in his hand feeling pitifully inadequate. Every shot he fired was for a fallen comrade, every burst of anger for a decade of lies. Aura was a storm of controlled violence. She moved through the enemy ranks like a phantom, her one good arm a blur of motion, disabling soldiers and light vehicles with precise, devastating strikes. But for every trooper she took down, 3 more took their place. Heavy cannons began to bombard their position, shaking the very rock beneath them. They were being systematically cornered, their options dwindling with every passing second. A voice, amplified and dripping with condescending authority, boomed across the battlefield. Captain Kalen, a surprising amount of trouble from a retired asset. And you have my property. Return the warden, and I may grant you a quick death. It was Administrator Valerius, broadcasting from his command ship, which now hovered directly overhead like a monolithic predator. It was clear this was a war they could not win. The Syndicate's power was absolute, their numbers endless. And on the planet below, a world was dying, its death screams echoing through the very fabric of space, felt as a deep, sickening vibration in Kalen's bones. The scale of the conflict had become impossibly large, threatening to consume not just them, but an entire system. During a lull in the fighting, as they took cover behind a shattered wall, Aura turned to him. Her violet visor seemed to look right through him. "There is a way," she said, her voice quiet amidst the chaos. "The network can be stabilized. Valerius can be stopped. But it requires an integration." "What kind of integration?" Kalen asked, reloading his last power cell into his pistol. "A warden must bond with the network's central core, become its consciousness. I can guide the power, heal the damage Valerius has caused, and permanently lock him out," she explained. "But the core has been corrupted. The data stream is poisoned with his crude attempts at control. A direct integration would destroy my neural pathways before the bond could be completed." She paused, and the weight of that pause was heavier than any mountain. "The integration requires a biological conduit, a filter, a human mind to absorb the initial shock of the corrupted data, to act as a living firewall. The process would erase the conduit, their consciousness, their memories, their identity. Everything would be burned away to create a clean path for me." Kalen stared at her, the truth of her words settling over him like a shroud. He was the only human here. The impossible choice was not hers to make. It was his. His life, his very self, in exchange for a world. For all the worlds the network touched. He thought of his empty life, the years spent in the shadow of a lie. He had survived the war, but he had never truly lived since. He was a ghost, haunting the graveyards of old machines. What was one more ghost, if its passing could bring about a dawn? He looked at Aura, at this magnificent being he had brought back into the world, who fought for life itself. His survival had been meaningless, but his death could have a purpose that resonated across the stars. The decision settled not with a crash of anguish, but with a quiet, profound sense of peace. The cynicism he had carried for a decade sloughed away, leaving behind the soldier he once was, the man who understood sacrifice. This was his final duty. He did not need a long, drawn-out deliberation. The choice was stark, the path clear. He looked out from their cover at the endless ranks of Syndicate soldiers, at the hovering command ship that blotted out the sky. He felt the tremors from the dying planet below, a constant, mournful heartbeat. There was no other way. This was the only move left on the board. He turned back to Aura. The violet light of her visor was steady, watchful. She knew what she was asking. The weight of her request was evident in her stillness, in the way her damaged arm hung limp at her side. She was offering a solution, but she was not commanding him. The choice was entirely his. "We do it your way," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of his entire existence. He reached into his jumpsuit and pulled out his old dog tag, a battered piece of alloy on a tarnished chain. It was the only thing he had left from his former life, a relic of the man he had been before the war broke him and the Syndicate discarded him. He held it out to her. She looked at the tag, then back at his face. Her good hand, a marvel of engineering and deadly force, rose with an almost human gentleness. Her metallic fingers, capable of crushing steel, closed around the small piece of metal with delicate precision. She did not speak. She did not need to. The light in her visor softened, and a low hum vibrated from her chest, a sound of sorrow, of respect, of acceptance. "The central core is located on the planet," she said, her voice regaining its focus, its sense of mission. "In the primary terraforming nexus, deep within Mount Tethys. We will need to get to Valerius's command ship. A frontal assault is suicide," Kalen stated, looking at the army arrayed against them. "Not an assault," she corrected. "A surrender." He understood immediately. They would allow themselves to be captured. It was the only way to get close to Valerius, the only way to get aboard his ship and force a path to the planet below. It was a desperate, insane gambit, but it was all they had. He stood up, dropping his pulse pistol to the ground. He raised his hands in the air. Aura rose beside him, her posture no longer aggressive, but passive. The plasma fire ceased. A tense silence fell over the battlefield. After a moment, a shuttle detached from the main group and descended toward them, its landing struts extending like talons. Forlag emerged, his face a mask of triumphant disdain. "The old soldier finally knows when he's beaten," Forlag sneered, his troopers surrounding them, rifles leveled. "And the broken toy. The administrator will be pleased to have his property back," he gestured with his rifle. "Get them on the shuttle, and put a null energy binder on the machine. I want it completely inert." They were marched onto the shuttle. A heavy collar was locked around Aura's neck, and the violet light in her visor faded to black. She became utterly still, a lifeless statue. Kalen felt a pang of fear seeing her inert, but he trusted her. He had to. This was part of the plan. They were taken to the command ship, a flying fortress of cold steel and Syndicate arrogance, and brought directly to the bridge. Administrator Valerius was waiting for them. He was an older man, impeccably dressed in a gray uniform that contrasted with the raw brutality of his ambition. He stood before a vast viewport that showed the tortured planet below, great cracks of lava showing on its surface like open wounds. "Captain Kalen," Valerius said, his voice smooth and cold as cryofluid. "I should have had you atomized with the rest of the Third Fleet's refuse. It would have saved me a great deal of trouble." He gestured to the inert form of Aura. "You have reactivated a very dangerous, very unstable asset. But you have also brought it directly to me. For that, you have my gratitude. You will now have the honor of watching as I finally bend it to my will." He turned to a console, his fingers flying across the controls. On the main view screen, a schematic of the network core appeared. Valerius was trying to force a connection, to bypass the Warden protocols with brute force. The planet below convulsed violently in response. "You're going to destroy it all," Kalen said, his voice low. "Destruction is a form of creation," Valerius replied without turning around. "From the ashes of this pathetic world, I will build an empire. This network will be its sword." That was the signal. Kalen dropped to one knee, feigning a collapse from injury. As Forlag stepped forward to haul him up, Kalen's hand shot out, grabbing the commander's sidearm. In the same motion, he fired, not at Valerius, but at the control panel for the null energy binder. The console exploded in a shower of sparks. The effect was instantaneous. The light in Aura's visor flared back to life, a brilliant, angry violet. She broke the binder from her neck as if it were made of paper. Before the bridge crew could react, she moved. She was not a soldier anymore. She was a force of nature. She disabled the guards with methodical, non-lethal precision, their bodies slumping to the floor. Forlag, recovering his senses, drew a plasma knife and lunged at her. "Die, machine," he roared. Aura caught his wrist, her grip absolute. She looked at him, her visor inches from his face. "Your fight is based on a lie," she said, her voice echoing with the power of a being far older than the Syndicate itself. She twisted, and Forlag's arm broke with a sickening crack. He crumpled, screaming. Valerius stared, his composure finally breaking, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "You cannot stop me. We are not here to stop you," Kalen said, grabbing Valerius and hauling him toward a smaller, private shuttle docked at the bridge's emergency airlock. "You're going to give us a ride." They forced Valerius onto the shuttle and launched, diving toward the fractured planet. The command ship's weapons were silent, its crew in disarray. Below them, the entrance to the primary nexus was visible, a vast, circular structure at the peak of the tallest mountain, glowing with uncontrolled energy. They landed hard on the entrance platform. The air was electric, and the ground shook continuously. Kalen shoved Valerius ahead of them, into the nexus. The chamber within was immense, a cathedral of precursor technology. In the center, a pillar of pure, white energy, the network's physical core pulsed erratically, lashing out with arcs of raw power. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Valerius whispered, a manic gleam in his eyes. "The power to make and unmake worlds." "You see power," Aura said, stepping forward. "I see pain." Forlag, his arm in a makeshift sling, had followed them down in another ship. He and a squad of his most loyal troopers stormed into the chamber, their weapons raised. "It ends here, traitor," he yelled at Kalen. "Hold them off," Kalen said to Aura. "I'll get the link started." She nodded once. Then she turned to face Forlag's squad, a lone guardian against a tide of hatred. As she engaged them, a whirlwind of motion and light, Kalen dragged Valerius to the main conduit console at the base of the energy pillar. "Initiate the Warden Integration Protocol," Kalen ordered, pressing the barrel of his pistol to Valerius's temple. Trembling with rage, the administrator typed in the commands. The console lit up, and a small, cradle-like interface extended from it. "It is ready, Captain," Aura's voice said in his mind. He was startled for a moment, then realized their proximity to the core must have opened some kind of psychic link. He looked over his shoulder. She was holding her own against the troopers, but she was taking damage, her chassis smoking from multiple plasma hits. She was buying him time. He turned back to the console. This was it, the end of his road. He took a deep breath, the ozone-rich air filling his lungs. He thought of the green world she had described, of the great song. He thought of the men he had lost. His sacrifice would give their deaths meaning, too. It would honor them in a way that hollow memorials never could. "Goodbye, Aura," he whispered. Kalen, her voice replied in his mind, and for the first time, it held an unmistakable echo of sorrow. "Your song will not be forgotten." He placed his hand on the conduit interface. Aura, disengaging from the fight, moved to the opposite side of the core and placed her own hand on a corresponding panel. The circuit was complete. Agony. It was not pain. Pain was a limited, physical concept. This was the dissolution of self. The corrupted data of the network, twisted by Valerius's greed, surged through him. It was a tidal wave of pure information, a billion screaming voices, a cacophony of broken code and raw, chaotic energy. His memories were the first to go, burned away like photographs in a fire. His childhood, his time in the service, the faces of his fallen friends, the long, lonely years in the decommissioning bay, all of it turned to ash. His identity, the very concept of Kalen, unraveled thread by thread. He was a firewall, and he was being consumed by the flames he was meant to contain. Through the storm of his own annihilation, he felt a second presence, Aura's. Her consciousness flowed through the path he was clearing, a stream of pure, clean data. She was calm, focused, powerful. She was taking the cleansed energy, weaving it back into the network, healing it, soothing it. He felt her absorb his final, fading spark of self, not to destroy it, but to preserve it. His sacrifice was becoming a part of her, a single, protected line of code in an infinite program. His last sensation was not of fire, but of peace. The screaming voices went silent. The chaos resolved into a single, beautiful note. The great song. He was home. Kalen's body fell to the floor, an empty vessel. At that exact moment, the pillar of energy in the center of the room stabilized, its chaotic lashing ceasing. It shifted from a harsh white to a soft, gentle violet. A wave of pure, calming energy emanated from the core, spreading across the planet in an instant. The ground stopped shaking. The lava flows cooled and solidified. On the viewports of the Syndicate ships in orbit, every weapon system, every engine, every control panel went dark, rendered completely inert. In the Nexus, Forlag and his remaining troopers stared, their rifles lowered. The overwhelming, undeniable presence of a vast and benevolent consciousness filled the chamber. It was a power beyond weapons, beyond armies, beyond empires. It was the power of life itself. Valerius, his connection to the network severed, his ambition turned to dust, collapsed to his knees, a broken man. The war was over. 10 years later. The planet, once named Tethys, was now called Kalen's Rest. It was no longer a fractured, dying world. It was a paradise, a vibrant green and blue jewel in the velvet black of space. The Syndicate was a footnote in history books, its tyrannical structure replaced by a cooperative alliance of worlds, all guided and protected by the benevolent network. The terraforming systems, once tools of a tyrant, now worked in harmony, nurturing life across the sector under the gentle guidance of the Warden. At the peak of the tallest mountain, the primary nexus remained. It was no longer a military facility, but a sanctuary, a place of quiet contemplation. The chamber was open to the sky, and gardens grew where once there had been cold steel. At the center of the room, the violet pillar of the core pulsed with the steady, gentle rhythm of a sleeping heart. Before it stood a simple memorial. It was not a grand statue or a soaring monument. It was a single, weathered dog tag, suspended in a permanent, softly glowing field of light. A young woman was leading a small group of children, telling them the story. They say the silent captain was a tired, broken man, she said, her voice soft with reverence. But when the time came, he remembered what it meant to be a soldier. He gave his spark to quiet the heart of the world, so the great song could play again. A little girl looked up at the glowing tag. "Can the Warden hear us?" she asked. The woman smiled. "Always. She watches over us all. Some say that on quiet nights, if you listen closely to the wind, you can hear her whisper his name." The children fell silent, listening. And in the vast, silent consciousness that was Aura, the Warden, the guardian of worlds, a single memory remained, cordoned off from the infinite data streams, pristine and untouchable. It was the image of a cynical man with sad eyes, placing his hand on a cold console, his face resolute. It was the memory of his sacrifice, the foundational note in her eternal song. He was not forgotten. He had become the peace they now enjoyed. He was the silent captain of a tranquil sea.